There are quite a number of occasions after we've been together that there are those who have said what was shared was very abstruse, but I prefer to call it stirring the pot. So this is one of those occasions where you might say there is a stirring of the pot. Several weeks ago and several times it's been asked, when we're no longer the pencil with which God writes, as Mother Teresa has said, nor are we the hole in the flute through which God plays, as the great poet Hafiz has said. What are we? The other day, Gail and I went to the ice cream shop on the road for a milk-free gelato. And when we went into the ice cream shop, there were some people sitting at a table outside, but there was no one in the ice cream shop at all. So we bought our ice creams and sat down at a table, and then all of a sudden cars started to come in and line up, and pretty soon the ice cream shop was full. So we were making a remark about this, is it an energetic? What is it that happens on these occasions? But there have been many, and one that I can recall in attending a seminar in the United States, and when there was a dinner where there were open tables, 10, and I went in and I sat myself down at an empty table, and pretty soon people came in and filled up all the other tables, and I was left sitting at the table on my own. So again, we can ask ourselves, is this an energetic of some kind? But it reminded of a story. So let's see what this story does for us, because it came to mind after this occasion, this incident. And it's a story about a town. It's not a very big town, and it's somewhere out there. And it's neither rich nor poor, but the people were all very unhappy. They were always complaining. The merchants would say, we don't have any rich people in this town to come and buy our goods. And the women were saying, the grind every day, cook, wash, sew, day after day after day. And the men would say, potatoes and stew, day after day after day. So it went on. There was a litany of complaints. Nobody was happy. Even the children walked around morose and not playing and so forth. So it so happened that the Supreme Being out there, as we are often told, was looking down and said to his bevy of angels, or her bevy of angels, whichever way you like to go, and said, would anyone like to go down there and try to deal with this? And one of the angels said, yes, I'll volunteer to go. So not long after that, at midday, when the sun was high in the sky, and most of the townspeople were gathered around the town square, in the middle of which was a magnificent maple tree, its branches spreading out so the townspeople could gather round in the heat of the sun in its shade. But mostly what they did when they did so was to sit around and complain to one another about the situations. But as the townspeople were sitting under the shade of the great maple tree, down the road came this strange being. He had on this purple garment with moons and suns all over it. He had orange pants. He had little shoes that curled up at the toes with bells on them. And he wore this funny little hat. with all kinds of colors. Well, being such a colorful character, it caught the townspeople's attention, and they sparked up for a moment. Oh, who could this be? Look at this interesting character. But then their negativity set in, and their doubts and their fears, and they all started to turn inward. And it was only the town mayor, who happened to be sitting down there, who was brave enough to speak up and said, who are you and what are you doing here? And this strange being said, oh, I'm just a traveler on the road, and I thought you wouldn't mind if I came, and this looks like a quite a prosperous little town. And well, that opened a litany, didn't it? Everyone started to complain. A prosperous little town. No, we don't have no business, and look, and so it went on and on and on. But it took most of the afternoon for everybody to sort of get it off their chest about all their complaints about what was bad about the town. So it came for the time for people to wander off and start getting their dinners and so forth. Well, the stranger who'd come into town in his strange costume, he just remained under the tree there as people started to filter away to go off to their homes to prepare their dinners and so forth. And eventually the square was empty and he was left alone. But then, of course, there began to waft into the square the delicious smells of the food, being steak and stews and potatoes, wafting out of the various houses that were around the town square. So the strange being got up and he started to wander down the main street and down the little lanes which had the inhabitants. And as he did so, as the dusk was coming down, he listened. And because it was a hot evening, people had their windows and their doors wide open, so he could hear and see into every house that he passed. And he again could hear the complaints and the moans and the groans that were going on, which was the habit of these people. But then, as he continued walking, the evening grew longer and the lights began to be turned out. And so he continued to walk the streets as one, then another of the lights of the houses were dimmed and shut out until the whole town was in darkness. So our strange being went back to the center of town, to the great maple tree. And, as was his capability, he floated up to a branch and sat himself in a crevice between the branches. And he pondered on what he'd heard and seen. And then, out of his orange pants, he took a flute. And he put the flute to his lips. And he blew a long, sibilant note that wafted down the streets, in the windows, under the door jambs, and entered into the hearts of every inhabitant of that town. And immediately that they heard this sound, they began to squirm in their sleep as though they were in dreams and nightmares and uncomfortable. And then he blew more notes on his flute. And they too drifted and entered into the very beings of all those that were there in their sleeping state. And then suddenly he blew one piercing sound, and everyone sat up in their beds and got up and came out into the streets. and began to gather round in the town square. What was this? What was this sound? What's going on? And again, it was the mayor who asked this question. What are you calling us here? What is this about? But our strange being didn't say anything, but he continued to play his flute. The sound of his flute bringing forth from the people, out of their beings, out of their hearts, out of their mouths, stones, pebbles, which gathered in a great pile under the tree. People were standing around with tears rolling down their faces. Some of the old women sobbing, like a great catharsis, a great release. And then he ceased his playing, and he began to pick up the stones, one by one. He picked up a great piece of charcoal, and he turned to the mayor of the town, and he said, "This is your frustration. This is your frustration at not being able to do what you long to have for these people, to have a good life, to have happiness and contentment and prosperity. This is your frustration." And he squeezed it in his hand. And when he opened his hand, there was a shining diamond with a string attached. And he hung it on a branch of the tree. And then, taking a stone by stone, he told each one of those townspeople, the teacher, "Look, this is your longing for your students to have a good life, to be successful, and your sadness that they are not fulfilling their possibilities." And he squeezed in his hand the piece of stone. And when he opened it, there was a beautiful emerald. Again it was hung on the tree, with every person he went to describing the deepest longing behind their sadness, their frustration, their anguish, their angst, and squeezing it in his hand, it became a beautiful gem which was hung on the tree. An old woman said, that's mine. What is it with me? And the strange being picked up the piece of slate, and he said, "Oh, this is your loneliness. Your children have left your house. Your husband has died. This is your loneliness. This is your longing for companionship." He squeezed the piece of slate, and it became a beautiful, shining gem. Pretty soon the tree was filled in the moonlight with the glittering gems from the hearts of the people who'd been gathered. And then he said, "Now it's time to rest. This is done." And taking his flute, he began to play a soft and lilting lullaby, and people drifted off to their homes, into their beds, where they lay in blissful sleeps. The next morning, the mayor woke up. The sun was shining, and suddenly he had a upswelling of well-being that he'd not felt. And then he put his foot in his shoe and felt something obstructing. And when he looked, he took out of the toe of his shoe the diamond that had been hanging on the tree. And every resident of every house experienced the same thing. They put their foot in their shoe, and found in the toe the gem that had been hanging on the tree, the gem that was created out of their pain, their suffering, their anguish, their loneliness, their longings. Of course, we know the end of the story, how strange angelic being returned to the heavenly realms, not to be seen again. If we're no longer the pencil with which God writes, an instrument of some divine force, and we're not the hole in the flute through which God plays, and yet we have these experiences for ourselves. There's no doubt that we've all had the same experiences as explained. How do we correlate these into what it is that there is now? Who are we? What do we do? Is it abstruse? No. Because they go together, don't they? Our emanations, our auras, whatever is coming forth, even when there's not some God pulling the strings or blowing. But the question that comes up to be asked is, what does the flute represent? What does the flute represent in this story? Relating it to ourselves and this dilemma we find ourselves in.
To me it represents the knowledge which allows you to go into a state of being.
Knowledge.
Because they say the flute of knowledge, right?
Okay. So would this be intent then?
To me it's more of moving into a genuine state of where you want to be. Based on that.
All right.
That's kind of what that was trying to do.
So the flute.
Transition state. It's like the transition state, the movement from to.
From in to in life, yes.
So the intent might be to move into a genuine state of who you actually are. Get rid of the suffering and turn into a gem.
Yeah.
Invitation.
And?
As an invitation.
An invitation.
Maybe even a piercing of
Yes.
the layers of all conditioning and sufferance we are involved with. It goes in which, without knowing the place of remembrance.
The only person we can change is ourselves. And so we start there.
We start there.
I think if there is a flute and God blows through it, there's still separation between us and the spirit. But in the end, there isn't that.
No. Right. Okay. Yeah.
It's interesting in the story that the music from the flute goes into the homes and works on people at a level that they don't understand. And it's like they're not even conscious of it, they're just reacting to
Yes.
the impulse that's coming in. He twice did that, and then the third one he made a big shrill where the people actually woke up and came out. It was like they were just like Pied Piper kind of thing.
Yes.
It's like the wooden spoon, the stirring of the pot.
The pot. Yes.
Yeah.
It's like they were being driven by an external force that they didn't understand, they just had to do it. It was like they were working from intuition kind of thing. And when they came out, then they were shown how they could transform their suffering into a gem. So their lives could be quite amazing.
Right.
So they could achieve their goals. but they didn't even know that was happening, apparently, because then they went back into their houses, and when they woke up, they had no memory of it. That was the story.
Right.
And they just found the gem.
Yes.
Then they had this feeling of well-being.
Yes. But again, I want to throw something in that's been spoken of over these last days, and that is that every aspect of every story is an element of ourselves. The Supreme Being, the angelic soul, the people, and the circumstances. So bringing it down to this.
So it's like we have to work on a deeper level as the story.
Absolutely. Can you see how this works when we bring it down to this recognition? It encompasses then the godliness, the angelicness, the mandate, the vibrations, the etc., etc. Does that make sense to us? And we live with this. Again, going back to that state of Satchit Ananda, existence, knowledge and bliss. How they come together, how they work together. What are we? What do we do? How does it work? Thank you.